Welcome back. So you remember that in the last set of slides and in the reading for last week, we were reading Aristotle, and Aristotle starts out his Nicomachean ethics with the observation or the claim that everything that we do, all of our activities, are done for the sake of some end. And the ends can vary from one activity to another. So the end of medicine is health, the end of economic science is wealth, and so on. And then this leads him to ask the question, is there anything that everything else that we do is ultimately done for the sake of? Is there some final end, some thing that he calls the chief good that everything else is done for the sake of? And I actually left you with this question last week to answer on your own based on your reading of the rest of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, sections 1 through 7. So now I'm going to give you the answer. The answer that Aristotle gives is happiness. He says happiness is the thing that we do everything else for the sake of. It's the ultimate goal of all of the other things that we do. I need to note that the word that is translated as happiness here in ancient Greek is Eudaimonia. And the ancient Greek word has some connotations that the English word happiness doesn't have. In particular, it suggests flourishing or living well. So this implies a kind of overall pattern of a happy life, something like being healthy and having good relations with others, having a family that's doing well, and so on. It's a more active kind of thing than the English word happiness. The Greek word implies activity and an overall pattern of life, whereas the English word, sometimes it seems like it could describe even just a momentary emotion, that one could be happy for just a second at a time in the English usage. But in Greek, with the Greek word eudaimonia, that would be a very odd and kind of meaningless, senseless thing to say. Like, people couldn't be happy just in 1 second, because eudaimonia is something that applies again to a kind of overall pattern of life, and it implies that someone is living healthy, is strong, is productive, is kind of overall doing well in their life. So with this word, as with others in this text, since the text is translated from ancient Greek, we need to bear that distinction in mind when we're evaluating what Aristotle says. He's talking about happiness in the sense of eudaimonia. That's what he's concerned to say is the chief good, and that's what he's then concerned to go on to define. The way he puts this at first is as a kind of report of what other people say. So he says, most agree that the final end of all of our activities is happiness. But he immediately then goes on to point out that people disagree when it comes to what happiness is. So even if there's widespread agreement that the final goal or the final end of all of our activities is happiness, it's still open-ended in a way what that final goal is, because people are just agreeing in using a certain word, but they seem to mean different things by that word. And if that's true, then we still have to ask what this thing, happiness, that's the final goal of all of our activities, is. And he considers a number of options, a number of things that people say that happiness is, okay, at this point in the text, which is Book 1, sections 4 through 5. He says some people say that happiness is pleasure, feeling good. That's what it is to be happy. It's just to feel good. Other people say that happiness is wealth, having money in the bank. Others say it's health. That you can think of this as a kind of conversation among friends. What's the most important thing to being happy? Is it pleasure? Is it wealth? Is it health, and so on? Is it doing the right thing, what Aristotle calls virtue? Is it having time for contemplation and inquiry and figuring things out, kind of pursuit of truth? Is that really what makes people happy? And Aristotle ends up disagreeing with all of these kind of common sense answers. He thinks that they're all too simple in a way, and he makes fun of people who give simple answers like this by suggesting that sometimes people change their mind depending on what they're struggling with at the moment. So, in a week where they don't quite have enough money, they're worried about paying their bills, they may say, now I realize, that wealth is the most important component of being happy. And then the next week, when they're having health problems, they have money now because they say they got paid last week, but now they've got a cold, and they say, now I realize, health is really the most important part of happiness. Just changing their opinion based on what they're having the most trouble with at the moment. And he thinks that clearly can't be a good account of what happiness is, because whatever it is, it must be something that's stable. What counts as happiness? There must be one. If the answer is the right answer, it must be an answer that survives from that continues to apply from one moment to the next, despite other small peripheral changes. Now, I want to make just 2 points. One is that after Aristotle gives his own answer to this question, he will then go backwards in a way to point out that his answer does in fact include some of these things that people had said from a more common sense perspective were identical to happiness. So he's going to end up saying that the happy life is indeed a pleasurable life, and the happy life will include some degree of wealth and health and honor. Okay, and the happy life is a virtuous life. It's a life that involves behaving admirably from a moral standpoint, and it very often will include contemplation in some sense. So he's going to end up saying that in a way, these answers aren't completely wrong. They're just inadequate because they're too simple, and each of them are kind of just holding on to one part of what makes happiness and not the whole thing. So his own answer is going to be more sophisticated. It's going to include these elements as parts, and it's going to be a more reasonable and defensible overall account of what happiness is. And the other point is that when Aristotle dismisses the view that happiness is pleasure, he's actually taking a position that continues to be controversial in philosophy. So some of the other philosophers that we will read very soon actually basically identify happiness with pleasure and say that that's just what happiness is pleasure and absence of pain. So Aristotle's rejection of the view that happiness is pleasure is itself controversial and something that one can argue with. Though, of course, Aristotle thinks he's right in dismissing it, and those who disagree with Aristotle think that he's wrong for dismissing it, and there ends up being a debate between them. So when you're asking the question, do I think happiness is just a matter of pleasure, or is a matter of pleasure by definition, or it involves other components, then you have to take a stand on that controversial issue, and hopefully you will do that by considering what are the reasons for and against taking one position or the other. Well, this set of videos has gotten a bit long, so I'm going to pause here and continue in the next video lectures.